I'm reading a small book written by a young Chinese girl called Irene Yuan-sun, The Next Factory of the World. And the young Chinese girl is saying exactly what I'm saying. He says that Africa can benefit from China. Africa can be the next factory of the world. But it's not just going to happen. Something must be done about it, which is what brings me to the last segment of my conversation.
This is the journey to One Africa.
I'm here to give you an elaborate introduction of our speaker this morning. And I believe at the end of this morning's speech, you would know that the elaborate introduction is all worth it. The speaker is an associate professor of public law, a holder of an LLB, that is Doctor of Law, on the Law of the Sea from the University of Ghent, Belgium, Master of Laws degree and Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Nairobi. The speaker holds an honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. He is also a holder of the degree of Doctor of Science from Bells University of Technology in Nigeria. He has been trained on human rights at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, University of London, England, humanitarian law at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of the University of Lund in Sweden, and on international humanitarian law in Geneva, Switzerland. He is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and Tanganyika, and a certified mediator. The speaker is a fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, a fellow of the Kenya Institute of Management, and honorary fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. And he is the chairman of the Farafina Investment Group in Monrovia, Liberia, an economic strategic growth and development initiative for Africa based in Nigeria. He is the immediate former director and chief executive officer of the Kenya School of Law, a former secretary of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, and a former director of the defunct Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, and is currently working on a number of projects. He is a renowned legal practitioner, and he has written several books, including The Criminal Procedure in Kenya, An Outline of Judicial Review in Kenya, Kenya's Long Search for a Constitution, and many others. The Postponed Promise and Judicial Review and Administrative Law. And he has published numerous articles in refereed journals and several book chapters. He has also edited several books, including The Devolution in Kenya, The Constitution of Kenya, and many others. He has co-authored The Constitution of Kenya, including many other books. And remember that in 2004, the speaker received commendation from the Kenya Scout Association for service to the society. In 2011, Bishop Okulu College of Theology of Great Lakes University of Kisumu awarded him the Order of St. Paul's the Apostle for restoration of good governance and right values in society. In 2012, the East African Association of Anti-Corruption Authorities recognized him for valuable and exemplary contribution in the fight against corruption. He has been named and recognized by the International Commission of Jurists, the Kenyan section, and the Law Society of Kenya for his exemplary contribution to the legal profession. He was recognized by the Kenya USA Association for the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award in 1996, and was the recipient of the 2008 Martin Luther King Africa Salute to Greatness Award by the Martin Luther King Jr. Africa Foundation. He has also been included in the markers Who is Who in the World and is the distinguished Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam for 2014. He has been recognized and has received the following awards and of course recognition. African Luminary Award by African Cultural Association in the United States of America. Freedom of the City of Lowell in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the United States of America for his role in the fight against corruption and bad governance in Africa. Recognition by the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the United States of America for exemplary work in the fight against corruption and bad governance in Africa. And currently, he practices law with Lumumba, and Lumumba advocates and coordinates activities under the PLO Lumumba Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor PLO Lumumba.
Thank you very much. Sometimes introductions can be so elaborate that you wonder whether you are the person that is being referred to. But in order to be a good guest, you don't stop the person who is introducing you. Permit me at the very outset to thank the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Coast, who is also the chair of this session. I also wish to thank the Pro-Chancellor, the cabinet ministers here present, drawn from several African countries, vice chancellors from different universities across the continent of Africa, the academics here present, our friends of goodwill drawn from different civilizations across the world, the students of the University of Cape Coast, and others who are attending this conversation this morning. I've been asked to share my thoughts with you on a subject that remains evergreen in this continent. Throughout the world today, Africans are engaged in a conversation on what it is that we must do in this continent to make her realize her potential. When you are keen, you will find that Africans who are residents in the United States of America are asking the question, what is it that we must do to make Mother Africa great again? It is not lost on me that only last week here in Ghana, the president of Ghana received African Americans who were engaged in homecoming. They were here to rededicate themselves to the struggle to make Africa great again. And it is not only Africans in America who are asking the question. If you meet Africans in Europe, they are asking, what can we do to make Africa great? You meet Africans in Asia and in Latin America, they are asking the same question. And Africans in the continent, whether you are talking about Africans in the west of Africa, in the south of Africa, in Central Africa, in North Africa, in East Africa, the single question that is being posed and waiting for an answer is, what will we do to make Africa great continent again. The reason why that nation remains alive and well is because history tells us that there was a time when this continent was great. Indeed, those who want to romanticize history will tell you that when the Europeans were in the cold and living in caves in Europe, Africa was great. There were empires alive and thriving in Ghana. There were empires alive and well, thriving in Mali. There were organized societies in Zimbabwe and in Eastern Africa. They will tell you that is our ancestors who built the pyramids in Egypt. One can only romanticize so far. They will also remind you that there was indeed a time when Africa was victimized through slavery, and that Africa went through that space for 400 years. They will also painfully remind you that Africa was the subject of European colonization, and historians will take you to Berlin in 1884 and 85 and remind you that the European powers in their selfish mode subdivided this continent arbitrarily into the countries that now constitute the continent of Africa. They will tell you sadly that the European powers, whether they were the Germans, they had a slice of their own of our continent. If they were the French, they had a slice of their own of our continent. Even poor Portugal at that time had a slice of our own of the continent. Even poor Belgium had a slice of our own of our continent. And even the arrogant British had a slice of our own of our continent. So that when we started struggling to regain our independence, we had been arbitrarily parceled out. And it was not lost on me that even at the beginning of this conference, one of the announcements that was being made is that there were Africans who are referred to as Francophone. In other words, there are those amongst us who, in describing them, we describe them by the language of the colonizer. Africa is the only continent that we still refer to as Francophone, Lusophone, Anglophone, and sometimes even Arabophone. It is not lost on me that even I am speaking in a language that is alien to us. I would have preferred to speak in Kiswahili, but that is the state of our continent. Very soon, we will call ourselves Chinaphone. So that when I am asked to talk about making Africa work for Africa, what can we do? We can only engage in that conversation in the context of history. What is it, we must ask, that has made Africa so attractive throughout the ages? There was a time when Europe was going through their first industrial revolution, when they were migrating from agriculture, and even before then they needed Africans themselves as a resource. So that in this Cape Coast, there is a monument to the atrocities occasioned by the Caucasians against us. Throughout this coast, you go to Elmina here, not far from here. You go to Liberia, to Sierra Leone, to Senegal, to the Gambia. You will find monuments to the atrocities committed against the Africans. Historians don't say it as loudly as they should, but over 1/2 of the population of Africa was taken out of this continent. If they did not find themselves in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they were working in the mines in Europe or building the underground railways in the United Kingdom or working in the cotton plantations in the United States of America. Africans built the world as beasts of burden. That is the Africa that we must talk about. And we cannot ignore that history. We don't talk about it as loudly as we should. The Jews were massacred in 1945. Only 6 million of them. But they have made sure that the world is always guilty about those atrocities. King Leopold of the Belgians killed 15 million Congolese. But we never talk about it. So when we talk about Africa and how we can make Africa work for Africa, we must remember the trauma that we must be suffering. Africa has never been left to rest. After they ended slavery, they came up with yet another project, the colonial project. And we struggled against the colonial project. Ethiopia was not colonized. The Italians tried until 1938, they failed. But Ethiopia was only one. Liberia regained our independence in 1847 when some of our brothers and sisters who had been taken to the United States were brought back. But the rest of Africa was subjugated. Portugal took our share in Mozambique, in Angola, in Sao Tome and Principe, in Guinea-Bissau, and in Cape Verde. And I can remember so very distinctly that until 1975, when I was a young high school student, Agostino Neto was fighting to liberate Angola. So was Jonas Malheiro Savimbi in 1975. I can remember so very distinctly as a young student in my lifetime, Samora Machel and Eduardo Mondlane struggling to free Mozambique I can remember so very distinctly Amilcar Cabral struggling to liberate Guinea-Bissau. So it is not long ago. It is yesterday in historical terms. They were kicked out by force of arms, the Portuguese. Did they leave? No, they did not leave. They engaged in political and economic shape-shifting, so that if you go to Mozambique, you go to Angola, and you go to Guinea-Bissau, the Portuguese influence is still there in a surreptitious and in a subterranean manner and in a pernicious manner. And if you doubt me, you only have to listen occasionally to their accredited ambassadors. In their unguarded moment, they still think that those countries are their fiefdoms, to be guided occasionally if they are out of line. But the most pernicious of the colonizers was France, pernicious to the core. I remember, courtesy of history, when in 1958, the Gaullist administration in France, having surrendered to the reality that Africans had to regain their independence, asking the colonies to vote yes or no. It is only Modibo Keita of Mali and Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, and to a certain extent Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, who said we will be free in poverty. And you remember what they did when they were leaving the French. They destroyed everything, leaving Guinea to die. They had written the obituary of Guinea. They had written the obituary of Mali. They had written the obituary of Algeria. And they ensured that their former colonies entered into a pact which is alive today, that their currency will be printed from France, and that their banks will be controlled from France. In the mind of the French, whether you are talking of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, whether you are talking of Nicolas Sarkozy, whether you are talking of Macron, in their unguarded moment, they still think that former French colonies are merely their backyards. That is the Africa that you are asking me to talk about, how she can work. And when they were done with us, do you know what they created? They created an organization of former French colonies, headquartered appropriately in Paris, France. And if you thought you had seen it all with the French, then they were the gentle and sometimes arrogant British. Why arrogant? The empire over which the sun will never set, they said, but it set. They colonized Nigeria, they colonized Ghana, and people fought against them. It was a great son of this land, the Osagyefo, Kwame Nkrumah, who on the eve of independence and on the day of independence reminded Africans on the 6th day of March 1957 that the independence of Ghana meant nothing if the rest of Africa was not free. So we regained independence from the United Kingdom. They gave us constitution. They called them the Westminster Model Constitution. Remember, we are in Africa, but our constitutions, whether in Ghana or in Nigeria or in Uganda or in Malawi or in Zambia or Kenya or Tanzania, are referred to as Westminster Model Constitution. British bureaucrats sitting at the Whitehall in London and giving us constitution. Go ye Africans and try it out. Africa became a laboratory for the ideas of European bureaucrats. That is the Africa that you are asking me, how does it work? An Africa for which once we had regained our independence, they created for us the Commonwealth of Independent States. And that Commonwealth is a Commonwealth of independent and equal states, they tell us. But the Queen is the head until the second coming of Christ. That Commonwealth which the United States of America, which was a former colony of the United Kingdom, cannot get into and is not a member of because she's too powerful to be superintended by a former colonizer. That is the Africa that we are grappling with. There is also another Africa, an Africa where Belgium, little Belgium, controls the Democratic Republic of Congo, controls Rwanda and Burundi. That is the Africa that we are talking about. Can she be great? Can she be made to work? Oh, the post-colonial African state was designed to fail. This is a question that sometimes we are too afraid to ask. There is also another Africa which, and recently as 1980, when I was a high school student, had not even regained our independence, Zimbabwe, called Rhodesia at that time. And then there is another Africa. Another Africa which in 1994, when I had graduated and was teaching and working, is when the Europeans recognized that they are equals in apartheid South Africa. Otherwise, in 1948, the Europeans in that country, the Boers and the British, took the view that Africans were children of a lesser God, that we were only fit to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. That is how they held until 1994. But as I speak today now, 80% of the land in South Africa is still in the hands of the whites. And they want to be compensated. They took it for free, but they want to be compensated. They had no passports and visas when they came, but they want to be compensated. They are saying the same thing in Zimbabwe. They want to be compensated. They want to be compensated in Namibia. They want to be compensated. That is the Africa that we are gathered here today to talk about. That Africa is a troubled Africa. Is an Africa which, if you permit me, I want to tell you, you paint, and some of these things are homegrown, some of them are engineered from outside, because poverty is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You know, sometimes when I listen to Kwame Nkrumah or read some of his works, I say to myself, his other human failings notwithstanding, he had the foresight of a Jewish prophet. Because as early as 1961 in Casablanca, Morocco, he told the leaders of the time that if Africa wants to work, Africa had to unite. But fellow Africans and friends of goodwill, even as early as that time, Europe was beginning to divide Africa. They had their own group. They had sponsored Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny to argue against the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. But Nkrumah did not stop there. He had other compatriots who thought like he did. Patrice Emery Lumumba did not go to anybody's university, but he was clear that Africa must write her own story. Julius Kambarage Nyerere, so that when Africa met on the 24th and 25th days of May 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the message was one and clear that if Africa was to work, Africa had to work as one unit. Kwame reminded the audience, let us unite today. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one country. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one army. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one currency. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with a common foreign policy. Because if we don't, we will each get used to our little sovereignties. Central African Republic will become used to the little sovereignty. Rwanda, Swaziland, Burundi, and all the other countries, and it will become difficult to unite us. But who listened to Kwame on that day? While he wanted the United States of Africa, we ended up with the Organization of African Unity, a loose alliance of heads of states. But you and me know that at that time the neo-colonial project had started working. I'm saying this because you are asking me to talk about how we can make Africa work. Before we talk about how to make her work, we must understand how she is. This is a diagnostic process. We are trying to understand the maladies that afflict her, because we must understand the etiology of these maladies in order to prescribe the right medication. So that the neo-colonial project was one that was meant to ensure that we appear to be independent. As somebody once said it in a most eloquent way, Africans were given the crown, but the jewels were retained. So in 1960, those who had started speaking about Africa and how to make Africa great were being eliminated one by one. In Congo, in 1961, barely 9 months after Congo had regained her independence, Patrice Emery Lumumba was dead. In Togo, barely 1 year after independence, Sylvanus Olympia was dead. And if they were not dead, they were removed. Here in Ghana, the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah was removed. In Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe was removed with Tafawa Balewa and the Sultan of Sokoto, Sir Ahmadu Bello. In Mali, Modibo Keita was gone. And if you go to all the countries, Amadou Ahidjo was gone. David Dacko was gone. Coup d'etats. That is the Africa that you are asking me to say, how will it work? It was never at ease. Destabilization after destabilization. That is the Africa. But the beauty of it that amidst all these Africans, whether they are in the political class, or in the academy, or in different sectors, even when they are engaged in activities that appear to undermine Africa, they have always been conscious of the fact that this continent needs to move in some useful direction. I remember 1960, 1961, as early as 1980, in Lagos, Nigeria, the Africans came together under the Lagos Plan of Action, and they said, we must make Africa work. The Lagos Plan of Action was meant to be an avenue of channeling African resources for Africa's benefit. Did the Lagos Plan of Action work as well as it was intended to? Not as well as it was intended to. So there have been many initiatives designed to make sure that Africa works. Some of them are homegrown, some of them are engineered from outside. Once again, begging the question, why is it always that people are prescribing for Africa what she needs to do? How many of you here will forget the Lomé Convention of 1975, signed in the neighborhood here in Lomé, Togo, African, Caribbean, and Pacific, telling us how we should cooperate with Europe as a way of immunizing ourselves from poverty and improving our lot. Is it in the best interest of Europe that we should do well? I doubt. And when the Lomé Convention had died its death, they came up with another one in 2000 called the Cotonou Convention. This belt, Lomé, Cotonou, appears to be a very favored site for signing these treaties. They signed yet another one in Cotonou to take over from the Lomé Convention. Once again, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, is it in their best interest that we should do well? And there is an old English saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And for whose benefit is the tune called? And they did not stop there. Everybody somehow is always interested in Africa and her welfare. How many of you here will not remember the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s? How many of you here will not remember the Millennium Development Goals? There were 8 when they came about. Now they have been renamed. Now they are Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 34 of them. How many of you here will not remember Africa Growth Opportunity Act? The House, the Parliament of the United States of America, sitting at the Capitol Hill in the United States of America, saying we open the space for African countries. And what are they opening space for? Textile. We will now, whether it is in Lesotho, whether it is in Nigeria or Nairobi, Kenya, our women and our young men are sewing jeans and other apparels which are taken to supermarkets in the United States of America. And once they have worn them and they are tired of them, they created another export opportunity of second-hand clothing. And second-hand clothing, that is why the textile industries in Kaduna in Nigeria died. That is why textile companies in Kenya, whether it was Rivertex, whether it was Kikomi, whether it was Mountex, they all died. Because Europe was now telling us, what we have consumed and rejected, you Africans must now consume. And when recently the Rwandese and the Ugandans said that we were going to stop the importation of second-hand clothing, they threatened us with sanction. Africa is meant to treat us new, that which Europe and America has rejected. That is the Africa that you want me to talk about. So when we talk about this continent of Africa, there have been no shortage of attempts to help her and for her to help herself. I remember on the 6th day of March, 1997, in Accra, Ghana, the former president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, speaking under the theme, the unity of Africa, said, among other things, that we have not come here to remind ourselves how important unity is. we know that African unity is significant. And he said, if Africa is to be a great continent and if Africa is to realize our potential, Africans must de-emphasize their Tanzanian-ness. Africans must de-emphasize their Ghanaian-ness, and they must emphasize their African-ness. And he went on to say, I'm not naive in appreciating that we have long been in our little corners, but I'm telling us that out there in the world, they only know us as Africans. And he reminded the audience that there are times when he has gone to Europe and his own colleagues in the leadership in certain parts of the world will ask him what is happening in Senegal while he himself is the president of Tanzania. So that is the Africa that we are talking about. So there have been many initiatives to make Africa great. How many of us will forget the new initiative for African development under NEPAD, signed in the year 2001 in Lusaka, Zambia, when Africans took the view once again that in order to grow, we must work together. There have been no shortage of initiatives to bring Africa together. And I remember in the very early days, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, the grand project as conceived by Kwame Nkrumah having failed to take off as it was designed to take off, many African countries took the view that the only way in which we could ultimately have the grand African agenda was to come up with regional developments. So we came up with the East African Community, and indeed, I can remember so very vividly, because even in Africa, there were days when Africa worked in the early days. In the early days, many African countries were recording economic growth of anything between 6 and 7%. In the early days after independence, there were areas where Africa was growing in education. In the health, the indices had improved so that infant mortality and maternal mortality indices were positive. We could see that in agriculture, Africa was beginning to feed herself. Africa was adding value to her things. I remember in Nairobi, in public schools, young school children would receive textbooks and exercise books. I remember that classes had libraries. I remember that in those early days, the public transport systems worked. I remember in those days that our agricultural products were receiving the kind of prices that they ought to receive in the world market. I remember in those early days in countries such as Zambia, the kwacha was strong because the copper was being paid for rightly. I remember in those early days in countries such as this one where cocoa, and in the neighboring Cote d'Ivoire when cocoa was being transported and you are receiving the right price. I remember in those early days diamond from Wadui in Shinyanga and diamond from Botswana and in Namibia were receiving the right price. There was a time in those early days when Africa was indeed moving in some direction. And I remember in East Africa when we had one common currency, when we had one airline, when we had one university, and things were moving. In the education sector, I remember students coming from Kenya and traveling to Fura Bay in Freetown. I remember hearing universities such as the University of Education at Winneba. I remember the University of Legon. I remember the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. I remember the University of Maiduguri, and I remember the University of Makerere in Uganda, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and many other universities. Africa was rising, but something happened. Something happened. Something happened. There are those who think that it was externally induced. They may be right. There are those who think that our leadership was also a contributory factor, and I think they are right. So that there is a sense in which we Africans are also co-authors of our own misfortune. We are co-authors in the sense that there is, and there have been opportunities to make us great. At the beginning of the address, the Vice Chancellor rightly remarked, the professor rightly remarked that in Africa there were countries that were doing better than South Korea. Kenya was doing better than South Korea. Kenya had a higher GDP than China. Ghana, the same. Tanzania, the same. Then somehow the Koreans went and left us. The Chinese during our lifetime have left us. The Singaporeans have left us. The Malaysians have left us. The Brazilians have left us. The Vietnamese after the war in 1975 have left us. Who is it? What is it that holds us back? What is it? Is it us? Is it some power? Are we children of a lesser God? What is it that holds us back? Why is it that Africa does not work? Why is it that I'm speaking to you now? Even what we call peace in many African countries is not peace, it's just silence. I've lamented for too long. Now I want to talk about what it is that we can do. But before I do that, let us look at our continent, at this continent called Africa. Our combined GDP, the 54 officially recognized countries, that is assuming that you don't ask the Moroccans about Sahrawi. Our GDP last year combined, the 54 of us, combined, all of us, 1.4 billion of us, our goods and services put together is no more than 2 trillion United States dollars, and I'm being generous about this. And to give you a perspective, the state of California in the United States of America with a population of slightly under 39 million has a GDP last year of 3 trillion United States dollars. To give you a perspective, and my good friend, the Honorable Minister from Burundi is here, their GDP last year was no more than 2.3 billion United States dollars. That is exactly the same amount that the state of New York in New York collects in one day. In one day. That is the continent that we are talking about, my mother Africa. How are we going to make her work? I want you to look at her. Look at her in the Gambia. What does she produce? Groundnuts. That is assuming that the Chinese will not come out with plastic groundnuts soon. And I'm saying this to tell us we are relying on goods which can be taken out of the market. And tourism. How many people visit the Gambia in the name of tourism? If they are more than 1 million, then we celebrate and we bring out dancers. Meanwhile, the bazaar market in Istanbul receives 99 million visitors every year. What tourism are we talking about? Let us go to Senegal. What is she producing? How can we make her work? How can we make Mauritania work? How can we make Mali work? How can we make Chad work when almost 70% of it has dried out in the last few decades? Then you wonder why we have Boko Haram, why there are recruits for Boko Haram and ISIS and Daesh. Go to Sudan and South Sudan, countries that are endowed with natural resources. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a paradox and an irony at once, the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources. But who will allow Congo to be at ease? Who will allow her? Because in her state of confusion, she is a jungle from which you can hunt without consequence. So when one rebel group dies, another one is resuscitated. I know of no African country that makes weapons except South Africa. The others just make bullets. The Kenyans will make bullets. The Ugandans will make bullets, but they have no gun to use them, and they import the guns. And yet the conflicts that are alive and well in Africa are legion. As the Central African Republic, there are conflicts which are no longer covered in the newspapers or in the media of the forgotten conflicts of Africa. Burkina Faso. And yet the African Union says that by the year 2020, the guns will be silent in Africa. 2020 is 28 days away from today. The guns will not be silent. And I'm saying this because to make Africa work, the guns must be silent. Because if the guns are not silent, our farmers will not grow crops. If the guns are not silent, our women will not go to the markets. If the guns are not silent, our resources will not be channeled in the right direction. The guns must be silent. We want to make Africa work. Will she work? Can she work? Yes, she can. But what are the fundamentals that must make Africa work? Let me remind you, Africa remains attractive. Why is Africa so attractive? Throughout the ages, it has always been attractive. It was attractive to the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Arabs, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Jews, but I will not say that. What I'm going to say that is attractive again, it is so attractive that every 2 years the Japanese call our leaders to Japan. That is how attractive Africa is. They call them to Japan in order to discuss how Japan is going to work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. I do not believe it. It must be for the benefit of Japan. It is so attractive that the Chinese leaders call Africans to Beijing every year. The 54 of them, they call them to Beijing. And they say this is how China is going to work for the benefit of Africa. I refuse to believe them. It must be that there is something that is being done for the benefit of Beijing. Because if I was Chinese, I would do that which is in my best interest, not in the best interest of Africans. It is so attractive that the Russians called our leaders only a few months ago in Sochi. And when they invite you to the best places. It is so interesting, so that the Russians can work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. That is how attractive Africa is. It is so attractive that the Germans also invited our leaders to Berlin. It is so attractive that even the Arabs are inviting them to Doha, and that is how attractive it is. Have you ever heard the Latin Americans being invited? No, I did not hear. Have you ever heard the Arabs being invited? No. It is only Africans who are invited. That is how attractive Africa is. Is it a bad thing? Depending on what you think. We can use it to our own advantage, or we can allow them to use it to their advantage. You know, when I look at Africa, and I look at her in the continent, in the context of how attractive she is, another word comes to my mind called globalization. When we talk about globalization, you talk about globalization as if it were a new word. It is not. Africans were once globalized as a commodity in the slave market. We were sold everywhere in the world. That was globalization. That was globalization. Then we were globalized again through colonization. Then we were globalized again through neocolonization. Now we are being globalized in the context of opening our markets. It is Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere who in one of his many enlightened moments said, when I hear the Europeans saying that we should open our markets in the name of globalization and they say that the rules are the same, I laugh, Mwalimu said. And he said, it is like a boxing match. The rules are the same. But you don't put a heavyweight boxer and a lightweight boxer and say the rules are the same. It is murder. Allow me to be melodramatic. You imagine the United States of America with a GDP of anything between 14 trillion and 15 trillion is now entering into a bilateral arrangement with Lesotho, whose GDP is 2 billion, and you say the rules are the same. It is a joke. It is murder, because the revenue that is generated by the city of Los Angeles alone in one day is more than the GDP of Lesotho. So we are being told to open our markets, and when we opened our market, you saw what happened? Our textile industries died. The large textile industry that we knew about in Kaduna, in Nigeria, died. Our cotton industries died. Our sugarcane industries died. Our waters, even water nowadays, water. Dasani, Coca-Cola gives us water. You go to hotels in African countries, the water that we drink has the standardization, not this one. This is from UCC. But this is the exception rather than the rule. This is the exception. The rule is water. Dasani, sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, determining what water we take, we of the middle class. Making Africa work is my subject. What will it take? It will take our combined effort. But there must be an enlightenment of a totally different character. You know, when I think about Africa, and I think about her often, and I ask myself, Mother Africa, how will you be 100 years from today? And I remember the great Sudanese poet, Alpha Ituri, writing about Africa. He says, oh, Mother Africa, how are you? Will you be great? You, Mother Africa, where your rebels have gained power and rebuilt, and they have destroyed what they rebuilt. Mother Africa, will you be great? You Mother Africa, Faituri asks, you the home of great rivers, will your sons ever fish in your rivers? Faituri asks, you Mother Africa, whose belly is laden with all things known as natural resources, will you ever give meaning to them? Faituri asks, oh Mother Africa, are you waiting for Godot? Mother Africa, I believe that Africa can be made great again. But remember I said that Africa took the view that she could grow regionally. That is where I went on a tangent. Now I come back. So the East African community was there. South African development community was there. We had COMESA, we had IGAD, we have ECOWAS, we had Central African Organization, we had the Maghreb, we had the Sahelians. All these attempts have been made, and somehow Africa is still punching below her weight. Let us look at the different sectors so that we are better able to appreciate what Africa can be. And I believe that Africa can be great. I believe that Africa is capable of looking at our agriculture, because if a people cannot feed themselves, they cannot be at the dinner table of civilization. Today, Africa cannot feed herself. Here in Ghana, they love rice. They produce a little and they import most. Here in Ghana, they love ketchup, but I suspect they import some. Here in Ghana, they love chicken. They produce some, but I suspect they import some. In Nigeria, I suspect they love meat, and I suspect they import some. They love rice. Here in Ghana, I know they produce cocoa and they love chocolate, but the chocolate they make, they don't like very much. They import chocolate from Switzerland. So until the day that we begin to like what we produce, so that we add value, I look forward to the day when the greatest chocolate making factories will be here in Ghana, and the next will be in Togo, and the next in Cote d'Ivoire. It can be done. Which calls into question, what are our universities of agriculture doing? Are they involved? Are they included in the agenda of making Africa great? And I'm saying that history has demonstrated that when people decide to work in agriculture, they can actually do something about it. I remember so very vividly in your own Malawi, when President Mbingu wa Mutharika took power, he took the view that he could improve agriculture in Malawi. He took the view that he could produce enough maize. He took the view that Malawians could do it, and you will agree with me, they did it. It was done in Malawi. Why can it not be done now? I remember so very vividly, those of you who are from Burkina Faso, in 1983, when Thomas Sankara took power, he took the view that the Burkinabe could feed themselves, and within 5 years, Burkina Faso could feed herself. It can be done. I know that right now, I remember so very vividly in Zimbabwe when President Mugabe took power, and even before then, during the first 5 years, Mugabe's government was capable of producing enough maize to be consumed in Zimbabwe and enough cotton to make clothes. Today, as I speak to you now, the Zimbabweans are under threat of starvation. What happened? It can be done in Zimbabwe, and I believe that it must be done if Africa is to work. Africa can work in agriculture. Africa can work in innovation. I'm very glad that in the last 1 year in Makerere, Uganda, they have come up with a solar-powered bus. Ugandans can do it. I'm very glad that in Nigeria, only last week they unveiled a car that is made out of hydrocarbons. Nigerians can do it. I'm glad that in Morocco now they have the largest solar plant in the world. It can be done. I'm glad that in my own Kenya, they now have one of the largest wind farms which generates power. It can be done. I'm glad that during the president of Akufo-Addo, Ghanaians have now abandoned one of the words they used to have in their vocabulary called dumso. I'm glad. In other words, if you look very keenly, there are things that can be done. And I'm suggesting to us that in order to do these things, we must ask ourselves how it can be achieved. As I draw to the conclusion of my intervention, I now want to talk of the new threats. How can we make it? A lot of writing has been done in the recent past about Africa. There are certain things that Africa must do, and there are certain things that Africa must not do. The belief that we can borrow money from multilateral institutions and become rich is misguided. Zambia's Dambisa Moyo in a book, Dead Aid, tells us it cannot be done. That is the route not to take. The belief that we will follow a model that is conceived on our behalf by European universities is misguided. I want you to read the book written by a Korean called Ha Jun Chang, The Bad Samaritans, in which he argues that each country must find a model that suits our own circumstances. It can be done. I want you also to remember a book which all of you must have read, written by my own Kenyan friend, Dr. Kalestas Juma, The New Harvest, in which he says that Africans must invent and innovate. I want you to read a book written by Olusegun Obasanjo and Greg Mills, among others, Making Africa Work. Africa can be made to work. But Africa will only be made to work when she is conscious of her current position, which brings me to a question that we must now pose. What is the danger of other powers operating in Africa? Do they threaten our being? And I'm now talking about China. China is a very interesting country from which there is a lot of things to learn. But she's also a danger to the continent if we are not careful. What is there to learn from China? The thing to learn from China is that during our lifetime, the Chinese, through their ingenuity, have succeeded in lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty. What did the Chinese do? Is there something that we can learn from them? I think there is. Those of you who have the advantage and the privilege of serving in government, ask yourself, what did the Chinese do that within our own lifetime they succeeded in doing that? And they are everywhere, the Chinese. They know what they want. I think the first thing that you must do, you must know what you want. You know, last year I was sitting and watching a Chinese news channel, and if you want to understand what others who are potentially your friends and enemies are doing, you must listen to their news. I was watching the CGTN, and I was listening to the 6,000 delegates in China sitting and thinking about China, how China will deal with Africa and the world 100 years from thence. The people who are there will not be alive. In many African countries, if you tell them to think about what will happen tomorrow, they say only God knows. No. I hold the view that when you are planning, you plan as if you will never die. And if you are prayerful, you pray as if you'll die the next minute. I'm suggesting that the Chinese have given us away. Today the Chinese, and see how the Chinese are working with us. Which university in Africa worth its name does not have a Confucius Center? I do not know whether you have one here at UCC. Why do the Chinese have a Confucius Center? Because the mind is the standard of the man. Once you influence the mind, you can sit pretty because you can predict what the mind will do. How many of you who are the middle class today, in addition to asking your children to read French and German, are now asking and encouraging their children, go ye and learn Mandarin? How many of you? Confucius Center to work on your mind. On our mind. And then, how many countries in Africa don't you find a stadium built by Chinese? And if it is not a stadium, it is your state house. And if it is not the state house, it's the African headquarters. And if it is not the African headquarters, it's infrastructure, is the road or the railway. And if it is not the railway, it is 4 lorries. And if it is not those, in the next 10 years, out of every 10 phones used by you will be Chinese. If it is not Techno, it is Infinix. If it is not Infinix, it's Huawei. No African country produces a phone, none. It's only Rwanda that is beginning to assemble some. There is something to admire about the Chinese. But if we want to benefit from the Chinese, we must be strong. We must be weak. We must not be weak. We must negotiate continentally. The Koreans are also small but strong. But if we are not careful, and I'm saying this, if we are not careful, in the next 25 years, all of us will be speaking Mandarin. If we are not careful. If we are not careful. Because the Chinese here are not here for charity. The Chinese are here to do business. And in the world of business, it is a cruel world where throats are literally cut. I'm reading a small book written by a young Chinese girl called Irene Yuan-Sun, The Next Factory of the World. And the young Chinese girl is saying exactly what I'm saying. He says that Africa can benefit from China. Africa can be the next factory of the world. But it's not just going to happen. Something must be done about it, which is what brings me to the last segment of my conversation, Africa Agenda 2063. I remember on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Nkosazana and Lamini Zuma, the then chairman of the Organization of the African Union, writing and reading an imaginary letter to Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. I will not remember the words exactly, but I'll remember it in substance. And in substance, he was saying, by the year 2063, we Africans, having recognized that we may have lost the last 50 years of our independence, will not lose the next 50 years of our independence. I'm adding a few things in order to make it relevant. But she was saying, in effect, the Osagyefo, in the year 2063, Africa will be different. There'll be an electric rail running from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to Dakar in Senegal. In the year 2063, Africa will be feeding herself, and the bread basket of Africa will be Zimbabwe in Southern Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will be making her own furniture, and we will do so in a sustainable manner, with the equatorial forests of Congo being the source of our products. I will remember in those years to come, what you now see as the Sahara Desert will have been greened. Africa will be covered in forests. The Democratic Republic of Congo will become the equivalent of the Silicon Valley. There will be rare earth. Africa will use phones made by Africans, Africa will refine their own oil. Africa will use our own copper. Africa will have excess electricity. Africa will have the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will have built the Grand Renaissance Dam. And indeed, at that time, Sudan will not quarrel with Ethiopia, and Egypt will not quarrel with Ethiopia. They will be using these resources well. Africa will not be importing fish, tilapia from China. The fish will be produced in Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Tana, and all these other places. That was the reason of Africa Agenda 2063. It was a dream. But is it not true that we must all dream? We must dream. The only thing that we must do once we have dreamt, we must wake up. The problem is sometimes we dream and we don't wake up. We must wake up and now begin to implement. Do I think that Africa woke up? I think Africa woke up. And that is how I understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a demonstration that beyond dreaming in a very amorphous manner, we now want to give form and character to our dream by operationalization, so that we begin to bring down the tariff and non-tariff barriers, so that we are able to ensure that Africa will do things that will make Africa great. Intra-African trade will be 80%. And that is why it gladdens my heart that Accra, Ghana was chosen to be the secretariat of the SCTF. I look forward to the day when the protocols are now being made, that we shall begin to take advantage of innovation. You remember Africa lost out in the first industrial revolution. Africa lost out in the second industrial revolution. Africa started gaining a little from the third industrial revolution. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution, where we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about robotics, we are talking about the Internet of Things. We are saying that Africa must now find her pride of place in those areas, so that Africa can be great in agriculture, Africa can be great in education, Africa can be great in value addition, Africa can be great in utilizing our fossil fuels, so that young Africans will not cross the Mediterranean Sea. When I look at Africa, I think that she can be made to work, but the last thing that we must do is to ensure that we introduce hygiene in our politics. Because it all begins and ends with leadership. History has demonstrated, not once, not twice, but times without number, that when you have men and women who are good leaders and they know what they want, they can catapult their countries within a short time into the higher orbits of development. We must now begin to ask ourselves, how do we govern ourselves? How do we create a political environment where all these things can happen? I'm suggesting to us, without being arrogant, I'm speaking hopefully with the humility that will not sharpen the anger of leaders in this forum, but will open their eyes. When you are in a position of honor and privilege, remember that your duty is to serve. Those of you who are cabinet ministers, remember that you are not necessarily the best of men, but you've been favored to be in positions of honor and privilege. You are not necessarily the best of women. Because you have been honored and privileged, serve in humility. And the problem in Africa is that many African leaders suffer from what I call the Jehovah complex. The Jehovah complex is a belief by those in leadership that they have the monopoly of wisdom and they have the monopoly of knowledge. That is not the route. Africa will be great when her leaders begin to know that they have a duty to serve, so that the future generation will be able to make Africa great again. Africa can be great. Africa will be great. Africa will be great in agriculture. Africa will be great in our industries. Africa will be great in our education. Africa will be great in all other things. But the last thing that Africans must do is to decolonize our minds. We must liberate ourselves from this misguided view that we cannot achieve. We can achieve, we have achieved, and going forward, working together, we will achieve. God bless.